The Flower Shop Block of the Month, January. Learn how to sew the Snowdrop tote. This is part of the Flower Shop Block of the Month, which is a series of 12 panels with instructions. Cutting out. Take out the fabric panel that comes with your kit and have a look, and you can see all the pieces are printed onto it and labelled. There are two flower arrangements, a formal one and an informal one, and you can choose which one you want to use on your bag. There are lots of little extra pieces, like you can see these snowdrops inside the cutout corners. You can use those for your other makes. There's a gift tag, 2 extra charm squares, and all the pieces are labelled with the relevant fabric label above them so that you know which is which. You'll also need some lining fabric to match your bag. Now start out by cutting out all the pieces. You'll need to cut the front of the bag as with the measurements listed in the instructions, and then with all the other fabric pieces, pin the label that's above it to the top of the fabric piece so you can remember which is which and which way up it is. So you can see I've cut out and labelled all the pieces here for the bag front and back, and the right side and the left side, and the strap outers and the strap linings and the pocket. Now you need to cut your lining fabric. The measurements for this are listed in the instructions. So you've got the pocket, you've got the front lining and the back lining. You need to, once you've cut them following the measurements, you'll also need to cut the cutout corners like this. The measurements for this are in the instructions, but you can also use the bottom of the base outers to cut out those as well. But all the information for this is in the instructions. Making the front outer. Take the centre front outer that you've cut earlier, and then take the front right side outer and the left side outer. Now place the right side outer, right sides facing, on top of the centre, so you can see you're placing it on the right hand side. Make sure you match up the top, bottom and right side raw edges and then pin together. Place a pin at either end. Then, making sure they fit together nicely, place a pin in the centre and sew that in place. Now take the front left side outer and place that right sides facing on the left side of the centre front outer. They will be exactly the same length because the pieces are printed and you've trimmed them to the same size. So again, match the top and bottom and side raw edges and pin together. Now sew together along that seam. Once you've done that, press the seams towards the side outers. Now take the front base outer, and that needs to be sewn along the bottom. Make sure the cutout corners are on the bottom. So flip over your joined centre and right and left sides and place that right sides facing along the top edge of the front base outer. Start by pinning it into place at either end, just to make sure that the sides match up. And then pin it together in the centre. To make sure that those seams stay pressed over to the side, pop a pin and it will hold them in place while you're sewing. It will just get a neater finish then and no twisted seams. Now sew the two pieces together. Once that's done, you can press it, and I've pressed the seam towards the base just to make everything lie nice and flat. Making the back outer and the pocket. Place the back base outer right sides facing along the bottom edge of the back outer. If you lay them out right sides up, then you can see which way they need to go. So I'm going to just turn them around to pin them together because I want to start sewing from the left side. It's just easier. So pin them together at either side. Remember, you're matching up the bottom edge of the back outer with the top edge of the back base outer. Matching up the raw edges, pin together along the length. Now sew these two pieces together. Once that's done, give it a good press, and I've pressed the seam towards the base. Now that the back of the bag is now finished, you can now make the pocket. So take the pocket outer that's on the panel and the pocket lining that you've cut from your lining fabric. Place them right sides facing and pin them together. So I'm matching up the raw edges all the way around, pinned together along the top edge, then down the side, one side edge, and then the other side edge. And then pin together along the bottom edge, but you need to leave a turning gap unstitched on this edge. So you need to mark this with your pins. If you take your tape measure and mark the centre of this edge and place a pin. Now if you measure 2 inches either side of this pin, this will mark a 4-inch gap that's in the centre. If you place vertical pins at either end of this gap, then you'll remember to start and stop finishing, just like I'm doing here. Now stitch together all the way around, starting at one pin, work all the way around and stop at the other pin to leave that gap unstitched. Now I've pressed the seams all over to one side, and for the turning gap at the bottom I've pressed the seams over to one side on both sides. Now to reduce the bulk in the corners, clip them off. Make sure that you don't cut the stitching, so cut just outside of it, but by clipping off the corners then you'll have much neater, crisper corners when you turn it right sides out in a moment. Once that's done, turn the whole pocket right sides out through the turning gap. Push out the corners with your fingers to start with, just to make sure it's all turned right sides out. And now, to make those corners nice and neat, use something like I'm using the stick for my turning tool here, but use something that's not too sharp to just push out the corners. The aim here is to push the fabric out at the corners, but don't push it too hard or you will pierce the fabric. So try not to use anything too sharp like scissors. Something more rounded will make sure you don't go through the fabric. So once you've pushed out the corners, making sure the seams lay right on the edge, give it a good press all the way over. Then also top stitch along the top edge of your pocket. You can see here that I've worked 2 parallel lines of stitching just to make it neat. The turning gap will still be open, but the edge is turned under. Finishing the outers. If you want to add some structure to your bag, then you can use wadding for a padded look like I've done here, or foam interfacing for more structure. If you want to do that, place the assembled front and back outers right sides up onto the wadding and press if you're using fusible or tack if not. Then add some quilting stitches. I've quilted along all of the wavy lines on the front outer, and I also quilted just around the vase and the bow. Once you've done all the quilting that you're happy with, then trim the wadding level with the fabric. So you can see on the back outer, I've trimmed it all level and I've quilted just along the wavy lines. Now you need to add your pocket. So whether you've added wadding or foam interfacing, it doesn't matter. You need to add the pocket either way. So measure 1/2 inch up from the bottom of the base, as you can see here. So just where that seam is, measure 1/2 inch up from there and place the bottom edge of the pocket on that 1/2 inch mark, and then just measure to make sure that you've placed it centrally across. You always add the quilting first before you add the pocket, because it just makes the pocket a little bit stronger, and if you want to add any quilting below it, then you can. But it also makes the pocket look a bit more attractive because it's almost quilted into it as well. But remember, if you don't want to add wadding or interfacing, you don't have to. Just add the pocket like this. So what I'm doing now is pinning it into place down one side, across the bottom and up the other side. Do make sure that it stays straight while you're doing this. Now once you've pinned it into place, down the sides and across the bottom, then sew it into place, down the side, across the bottom and up the other side, but obviously leaving the top unstitched. Now your pocket is nice and neatly attached. You can add a vertical line down the centre if you want to divide the pocket, but that's entirely up to you. Now to join the front and the back together, place the front outer and the back outer right sides facing, and matching up the raw edges, pin it together. If you've added foam or wadding, then obviously you'll have those layers. If you haven't, you'll just have the fabric. When you come to the base sections, just check that the seams line up, and then you'll get a neater finish because the base seams will run nice and neatly from the front to the back. And then pin it together at the bottom edge. Now pin it together along the bottom. You don't need to pin around the cutout corners because you won't be sewing along those. So just pin it down the side and then across the bottom. Again, always make sure the raw edges are matching up. And then pin it together up the other side. Again, just make sure that the seams of the front and the back match up at the base sections. I've just rolled them back to make sure, and then pin together at the bottom. And pin together at the top. Now sew together down the side, not around the cutout corner, across the bottom, not around the other cutout corner, and across the top. So you're leaving the top and the cutout corners unstitched. Now once that's done, you can turn it right sides out and your front and back outer are joined together. Don't worry about the box corners, we'll be dealing with those later when we attach them to the lining. So your front, your outer of your bag is now complete. Making the lining. Place the front lining and the back lining right sides facing. If you've used a plain fabric, it doesn't matter which is the right side, but if you've used a print fabric for your lining, then just place them right sides facing. Match up the side edge, so I'm matching up the right hand side edge here at the top and the bottom and pin together. And then pin together between those ends. Now pin together the other side edge, again match up the top and the bottom, making sure the top, bottom and side raw edges match up, and pin together. Now you need to pin it together along the bottom edge, but we're going to leave a turning gap in the bottom of this edge so that we can turn the bag right sides out later. So pin it together either end just to make sure it's all matching up. Now take your tape measure and measure the halfway point along here. So just pop a pin in halfway. You could fold it if you prefer, I'm just measuring it here, and then measure 2.5 inches either side of this halfway point. And then by doing that, you will have a 5-inch gap left and it will be central. Place the pins vertically either end of this turning gap. Then you'll remember to stop and start stitching here because you can see they're the ends of the gap. Now sew the two pieces together down the side, across the bottom, but not along the turning gap, so just either side of that and up the other side. Don't sew around the cutout corners or the top edge. Once that's done, the lining is finished and I've pressed the seams open and flat. Now turn it right sides out, ready to attach the magnetic snaps. Now this is optional, but it will help to keep your bag closed. So start off by finding the centre of the front edge of the lining. I've done this by matching the side seams and then just making a little crease. You could measure to find the centre or you can fold it like I've done. Now we're going to measure down from the top edge. So measure 1.5 inches down and with a pencil or an erasable pen, just make a little dot. Now take all the pieces for your magnetic snap. You'll have a male section, that's the male section, that's the female section, and then you will have 2 washers or back plates. Sometimes they're called washers, sometimes back plates. Now take the male section and one of the washers. Place the hole in the middle of that over that hole that you've marked 1.5 inches down and draw through the slots to make vertical lines. Now cut through these slots. A seam ripper is ideal for this. Make sure you're only cutting through the front lining, not all the way through. push the seam ripper in and cut along those slots. If you don't have a seam ripper, use some small sharp scissors, but make sure you only cut through these little lines. Now, take a piece of wadding. This will be left over before, or you can take several pieces of fabric if you don't have wadding. About a 1.5 inches square is okay, or felt is good too. Place the washer on top and draw along those slits, just like you did with the fabric, and cut along them. Now take the male section and place the prongs through those cutout slots, going from the front to the back of the lining, and then place the wadding or fabric or felt that you've cut over that, and you've cut the slots. Now take your back plate washer and place it over the prongs. Now I like to fold my prongs inwards now to secure. Some people prefer to fold them outwards, so whichever you prefer. And that's the male section attached to the front lining. Now turn the lining over and either fold and mark like I'm doing, or measure and mark the centre of the back edge. If you're folding, make sure you match up the side seams, make a little crease and open it out. And you'll be able to see here that that little crease is level with the crease on the other side. Now, just like you did before, measure 1.5 inches down from the top and make a mark on that centre line. Just make sure that that little mark is level with the centre of the other washer, a back plate, so that you know they're in the same place. Now just move the back lining slightly out of the way of the front lining, so it's easier to draw and cut. Place the back plate central hole over the hole, the mark you drew. This is just like you did before. Draw the vertical lines and then cut the vertical lines with a seam ripper or small scissors. Again, take a piece of spare wadding or fabric or felt. Draw the vertical lines. Cut along them with a seam ripper. Now take the female section of the magnetic snap, place the prongs through the cut holes from the front to the back. Place the wadding on top and then fold the prongs over. Either inside or outside, inwards or outwards, depending on what you prefer. Now your magnetic snap is attached. Turn the lining wrong sides out, because that's how it will be in your bag, and just double check before we go any further that it all matches up nicely, that the top edges match. So once the magnetic snap is attached, you place the female into the male, then just make sure everything matches up if you need to make any adjustments. Making the strap. Take one strap outer and one strap lining. You can remove the labels at this point and place them right sides facing. Make sure you match up the top, bottom and side raw edges and pin them together all the way along the length down both sides. Once you've pinned them together, stitch them together down the top long edge and the bottom long edge, leaving both side short ends unstitched. Once this is done, press the seam allowances over to one side and you need to turn it right sides out. I've worked a long tacking stitch along one end because I'm going to use my turning tube to turn it right sides out. To do this, place the plastic tube inside the strap all the way to the end that you've tacked across. Now, taking the stick that comes with the turning tube and using the blunt end, push the strap all the way through the tube and it will turn right sides out neatly. If you don't have a turning tube, you'll just have to turn it right sides out. Pull out the strap and there you can see it's turned out really easily. Now you need to undo those tacking stitches that you worked at one end, which is why it's best to use a long tacking stitch either by machine or a running stitch by hand. Undo those stitches. Then you can remove the stick. And any spare stitches that still aren't undone, just snip those to remove them. Once that's done, press your tube and your strap so that the seams lay right on the edges, so it's nice and flat. And it will look like this, so you can see it's nice and flat. And the seams lie right on the edges. Now top stitch down both long edges. This will neaten it and hold the lining and the outer neatly together. And then your finished strap will look like this. Just trim off the ends, just the very ends, so that you've got a nice neat end to start with. And this will also remove the thread ends as well. So that's one of your straps finished. Repeat that with the other strap outer and strap lining to make the other strap in exactly the same way. Assembling the bag. Take one strap and place it right sides facing on the front outer. The outer edges of the strap need to be positioned 3 inches in from the side seam, which is actually where the seam of the left side outer joins the centre front outer. Now take your strap and place it right sides down, and then measure to make sure that the end of the strap extends 1/2 inch above the top raw edge of the bag. This just gives it extra security and stops it being pulled out. Pin it together along the top and then pin it together a little bit further down, making sure it stays straight. So if you line it up with that seam, it will stay straight. Now take the other end of the strap, run the strap through your fingers to make sure that it stays laying flat and isn't twisted. And then place it right sides down on the other side, again 3 inches in from the side seam and extending 1/2 inch above. So if you match up the outer edge of the strap with that seam, pin it together along the top, and then a little bit further just to hold it straight. And then tack the strap into place across the top and then a little bit further down where you've placed that second pin. The second row of tacking stitches will be removed later. Once that's tacked into place, repeat this to pin and sew the other strap to the back of the bag in the same positions. Now place the outer and the lining wrong sides facing. So if you turn the lining wrong sides out, with the outer still right sides out, place the outer inside the lining. Now take the side seams and match them up. Make sure the front outer and the front lining are together and the back outer and the back lining are together. Match up the side seams, so you can see here that I've pressed those side seams open and that they are right sides facing. Pin together at one side seam, then turn it around and pin it together at the other side seam, again making sure that those side seams stay pressed open. When you pin them to hold those seams open. It just reduces the bulk because they'll be a bit flatter. And once that's done, you can pin the front outer to the front lining and the back outer to the back lining all the way round, making sure you match up the raw edges and tucking the looped ends of the strap to the inside so they don't get caught in this seam. They will fit exactly because you've cut them to the same size. And you will see here that the ends of the straps are sticking up by 1/2 inch above the top. When you come to do the other side, just push the strap inside so that it loops downwards because you don't want it to get caught into this seam. And again, matching up the raw edges, pin them together. Once it's pinned together, then sew them together all the way around the top edge to join the outer to the lining. Once that's done, you can see I've seamed it all together. Pull the outer out of the lining so that the two sections are laying flat. And then with the seam that you've just sewn, open it out and press it open. By pressing this seam open, it will help that seam to lay right on the edge later on. So press it open and flat all the way along. Boxing the corners. The corners of the outer and lining are boxed together at the same time as it keeps the lining held inside the outer. On the outer section, take one side seam and the base seam and place the seams so they are right sides facing and the seams match up exactly. Clip them together and then clip them together either side. You can use pins for this instead, but you'll be repositioning these in a moment, so it's quicker and easier to use clips. Now lay out that corner nice and flat so you've got some angled edges at either side and clip those as well to hold it nice and flat. Now run your finger along the seam from the outer, along the lining and take that corner. Now place the side seam and the base seam of that lining, right sides facing, making sure that the seams match up exactly and clip them together. Then clip them together either end of those raw edges and clip them together at the other side. So you're clipping across the corner. In the same way, open out the corner and make it nice and flat with your fingers so there are no creases or pleats, and clip on those angled sides to hold it nice and flat. Now take those two, the outer and the lining, again following the seam to make sure you're matching them up, and make sure the seams are facing and bring them together. Now this is where you need to reposition the clip, so make sure the seam on the outer and the lining match up. And remove one clip and clip those together so the seams match up exactly. And then do this along the top edge as well. So you can remove a clip and reposition it. If you've used pins, just be careful that you make sure that you take out the pins and reposition so you haven't got any left on the inside. So I'm clipping together across the top edge and then down those angled sides. I like to put a couple of clips in the angled sides just to hold them nice and flattened together so that you don't get any pleats or creases. Once you've clipped the outer corner to the lining corner, sew together through all of the layers. And then it will look like this, and you've boxed the lining and the outer together at the same time. Now to do the other one, clip the outer, just like I did before, and then clip the lining. I've done these in advance. Now making sure that you follow the seam with your finger, fold the lining over onto the outer so that the seams match up. And then hold the two together, just like you did with the other corner, making sure that the seams of the outer and the lining match up exactly. Reposition the clips and then along the edges of the corner as well. And then down the side angled edge as well. Putting 2 or 3 clips here just to make sure it's nice and neat. And then do the other side. So match up the raw edges of the outer. So you've got 4 layers here. If you've got wadding, you'll be going through all of that as well. And then clip down the sides. Then once that's done, sew together across this corner. And then you've boxed both corners together at the same time. And you end up with it looking a bit like a pasty with everything tucked inside, but all neatly, and you've boxed both of the corners at the same time. Finishing off. Turn the whole bag right sides out through that turning gap that you left in the lining. It feels like it won't turn out because you've sewn all those corners together, but just push the whole bag through the turning gap in the lining. And then if you push the outer outside, the lining will stay inside. So push the lining inside the outer. And then if you put your hand through the turning gap in the lining, you can just make sure that you push out all of those corners. It's easier to do that whilst you've got a gap in the lining before you sew it closed. So push out just the corners of the outer so that they're nice and crisp and you've got the corners right in the edges. Once that's done, turn the whole bag lining sides out. And you can now stitch the turning gap closed. So take the edges of the turning gap that you pressed under later, make sure they're turned under. You've turned them under by 1/4 inch, which is the seam allowance, and pin them together. Make sure you only pin the lining edges together and don't pin into the outer at all, because it's only the lining that you want to be sewing. So turn the edges under and pin them. Then sew that turning gap closed, either by machine or hand, close to the edge. Once you've done it, it will look like this. Now you can turn your whole bag right sides out again. Push the lining back into the corners again to make it nice and neat. Now you can see that the lining stays right inside the outer without it coming out, because you box the corners together at the same time. You get a much neater finish. Now remove that second row of tacking stitches, the one that you put in earlier when you were attaching the straps. These were just to keep it straight, but you don't need them now, and the straps need to be facing upwards for the next stage. So just undo the tacking stitches. I've used a seam ripper for this, and then just pull out the loose threads. Take care when you do this, don't do it too quickly, because you need to make sure that you don't snip the fabric at all and that you only cut the stitches. Once you've taken out the ones from the front, you can take out the ones from the back. This is why it's best when you do these tacking stitches that you use the longest stitch on your machine. They're quicker to take out and they mark the fabric less. And then undo the tacking stitches from the final end. Now making sure the straps are facing upwards, extending beyond the bag, roll this top seam between your fingers and give it a press as well to make sure that the seam is lying exactly on the edge and that you don't have the lining sticking up above the outer or the outer going to the lining. So roll it between your fingers and give it a good press. Then top stitch around the top edge to hold the lining inside. You can see from here I worked 2 lines of top stitching just to give it some extra decoration, gives and makes the top a bit more stable, or you could use a decorative stitch on your machine if you prefer. Now the magnetic clasp will hold the bag closed. The lining is held neatly inside. And your bag is now finished. To make sure the base is a little bit more structured and shaped, fold from one corner to the other and press. And then on the other side from the other corner and press. And that just gives you a squarer base effect. And there you are, you're now ready to take your snowdrop shopping.